Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk series. Today's program features Sonia Hazard and her newest book, Empire of Print, Evangelical Power in an Age of Mass Media, which was recently published by Oxford University Press. The virtual book talks highlight recent work broadly related to book history, print culture, and material text, and this program is sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. AAS is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past through our collections, through our inclusive public programs, and our support for researchers. We welcome researchers from around the country and around the world to use the collections both in person and virtually. My name is John Garcia, the Society's Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships, and I'm joined behind the scenes by our Programs Coordinator, Lauren Havilis. Throughout the program, Lauren will post useful information into the chat, including a discount code so you can purchase a copy of Sonia's book. As a reminder to all, today's program is being recorded and it will be available soon on our YouTube channel. We thank you for joining us, and as a nonprofit organization, we greatly appreciate any support you can lend to help us with our mission. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Sonia Hazard is Assistant Professor of Religion at Florida State University, where she specializes in early American religion, U.S. history, media, material texts, and new materialisms. And at FSU, she also currently directs the More Than Human Religion Initiative. Sonia is well known to us at AAS. She held a J. and Deborah Last Fellowship on 2 occasions, and in 2019, she held a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. And in 2023, along with Christopher Allison, she co-taught the summer seminar, Material Religion, Objects, Images, and Books, which is jointly offered by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture, as well as the Center for Historic American Visual Culture. Sonia is also a founding member and senior fellow with the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School, and she has published widely in many venues in addition to her newest book, in journals that include Material Religion, Church History, Early American Studies, and many others. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sonia Hazard.
Hi, thanks so much, John. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, there we go. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks especially to you and Lauren for putting this event together. I know it's a lot of work behind the scenes. I want to begin by saying that the AAS has meant a great deal to this book and to me personally. It was at the AAS in January 2013, which was a long time ago, that I did my first archival research for this project. It was then a dissertation, and I think it's fair to say I had no idea what I was doing. But there were many people like Paul Erickson, Molly Hardy, Lauren Hughes, Elizabeth Pope, Laura Wasowitz, and Nan Wolverton, who shared their expertise and kindness with me. That fellowship ended up being really pivotal for this project's direction. I received another major boost from taking the 2015 summer seminar with the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. That year, it was convened by Lynn Festa and David Brewer. The theme was Books in the Larger World of Objects, and that really allowed me to glimpse a path forward for the project. Finally, that NEH fellowship, that was over the first part of 2019. That's what allowed me to rethink the dissertation as a book. I learned a great deal during that time from Brianne Barrett, Dan Boudreau, Ashley Caltaldo, Nate Fisk, Kim Toney, Vince Golden, Amy Timms, and Beth Samus. It was also then that I met my dear, dear fellow fellows and friends, Ben Bascom, Alex Berenger, Elspeth Martini, Don James McLaughlin, and the late Neil Salisbury. So thank you all for contributing to the project. My book's object is the American Tract Society, the ATS. It was a Christian benevolent society and publishing Goliath in the 19th century United States. Between its founding in 1821 and the eve of the Civil War in 1861, that's the end date of the study, the publisher circulated 5.6 billion with a B, pages of evangelical print through the United States. That's an astonishing number. If you put all of these pages of print end to end, it would go all the way to the moon and then halfway back. The publisher printed at these magnitudes in the aim of putting evangelical print media in the hands of every American citizen, no matter how remote. The big goal was to win the souls of white settler colonists and thereby secure the young nation for Christ and lead the whole world into the millennium. What you're looking at is an early certificate of membership that shows something of the ATS's ambition. So here's the close-up. In the middle, you have the press and the angels are taking tracts that are hot off the presses and then flinging them into the air. As you can see, kind of over in the right background, there's the world's people are very eagerly, palms open, ready to receive the word. As stunning as 5.6 billion is as a number, the power of evangelical media in this period stemmed not only from the quantity of media objects it printed, but for what came next. And it's that what came next that's the subject of the book. How the ATS managed to move its publications across the expanse of a growing American empire. Tracts didn't actually fly through the air. Place them in the hands of scattered readers and induce those readers to read them and embrace their messages. The argument of the book is that to reach American readers, to transform their hearts and minds, the ATS built an infrastructure. Beyond the bare printing of texts, infrastructure is what mobilized those texts and created situations in which people found them compelling. So what is infrastructure? I define it as a semi-durable assemblage of humans and non-humans connected over space and time. It enables producers to make a difference on faraway end users. That prefix, infra, indicates that infrastructure is meant to pass unnoticed. It works below or beneath what appears more visibly on the surface. In the book, I'm specifically concerned with a subset of infrastructure called media infrastructure, and I'm taking this largely from media theorists. This is what makes possible the delivery and beholding of media content. It encompasses both the material format of the media object, its physical container, like that, and also the material paths of its delivery to users. With television, for example, that would be the TV set and the cables that bring the signals to your house. Leaders of the ATS cared deeply about both of these aspects, the format and the mode of delivery. And the reason they cared for them was because they saw them as arenas for engineering situations that would guide reader response and maximize those conversions that they wanted. Infrastructure is thus not only an object of study, but a style of power. It was a pervasive, though underappreciated style of religious power in the 19th century. As an initial example, let me start with the ATS's signature media format, the tract. And by the way, this photo and all the others from the AAS collections were taken by Nate Fisk, who's uncommonly excellent at capturing archival objects, and that's Nate's hand there in the photo. Tracts were thin booklets, cheaply produced and without bindings. They usually contain little stories of exemplary evangelical lives, paired often with some sort of hectoring, anxiety-provoking appeal. Don't you know, reader, that time is getting short and soon you will be in your grave, that sort of thing. The ATS poured its resources into shaping this humble object so that it would encourage certain practices of handling and reading, increasing the likelihood that the reader would convert. Tracts had what James Gibson has called affordances. They afforded or encouraged certain actions based on their physical constitution. While the ATS did not invent the format of the tract, they did theorize and perfect its affordances, poured resources into their production, and manufactured them at a mass scale. For one thing, tracts moved. Unlike heavy-bound books, which were difficult to ship and even then liable to sit on a shelf full of inertia, tracts were made to move. They could be passed hand to hand, they could be tucked into a letter, left behind to be found by somebody else, carried in a pocket, and then consulted in spare moments. They could also be easily carried and shared by benevolent evangelical volunteer distributors, whom the ATS trusted to happily and frequently do so. I'm showing you this slide, which I really like because it's an image of a tract from the collections at the University of Virginia that actually shows, testifies to its mobile maneuvers. It's got all these fold marks. It was clearly folded up, and somebody has clearly read it, almost to the point of disintegration. For all of these reasons, the tract, according to the ATS's president, was, to quote him, the Bible of the wayfaring man. Another way of putting this point is that the tract was a religious media format tailor-made for settler colonialism. It was ideal for reaching scattered and mobile readers over vast distances. For another thing, the ATS's tracts were attractive. They were eye-catching. The ATS made a great deal of this. They were very vain about it. Unlike books which were covered up in bindings, obscuring the content inside, tracts had text and often images right on their faces. They also came covered in colored paper wrappers like these, and these here are tracts designed for children, but they also used color for adults as well. All of these material features were intentional. All of it was designed to attract the distractible attention and focus it, making a nearby person likely to take notice and open the pages. A related point is that the ATS's tracts were generally well constructed, especially compared to most pamphlet printing at the time. Leaders thought that this concern for quality would make tracts universally appealing. They had a refrain that went, for high and low, rich and poor. Tracts were supposed to be appealing to everyone. Tracts also had a sneaky staying power. What I mean by that is because of their unobtrusiveness, they had a tendency to stick around and show up in odd places. Furtive distributors, for example, recounted stuffing tracts into the pockets of drunks who would discover them the next morning, upon recovering from their stupor, and then, really reflect on their soul in that compromised state. The ATS also published reams of anecdotes describing tracts being repurposed for non-pious reasons, as wrapping papers say, and then someone incidentally finding them and then being converted by them. Leaders loved this sort of thing. They celebrated tracts as having an almost magical ability to maneuver into the world's crevices. This tract, which I found in the collections of Florida State University, where I work, is an example of what I mean. It survives because it had been shuffled among the manuscript sermons of a pastor in Pensacola. He seemingly kept this tract around because of its usefulness as an ink blotter. So presumably the pastor did not need converting, but still, here's an example of the sort of staying aroundness, the near to handness of tracts, which is a quality that bound books, say, don't have, at least not in the same way. My point is that through these qualities of format, a part of media infrastructure, there's a whole script of reception built into the object of the tract itself. If the infrastructure were well constructed, a person encountering a tract, perhaps a person like the one illustrated here, would find herself touched by a force from outside herself. Perhaps the paper tumbled out of her apron pocket, where she had slipped it earlier without thinking about it too much. Now the loud typography on the wrapper caught her eye. These infrastructural properties created a situation that cued her to open and begin reading a text that she might not have thought much about initially, stirring feelings that were not otherwise present. The tract surprised her. It changed her course. Of course, she could have accepted the tract to be polite and then never bothered much with it. That possibility of the failure of governing reception is equally important to my understanding of infrastructure. Infrastructure is what guides or prompts a reader, short of coercing or subjectivating her. It gets up close to a person and asks her to read. We could even say that it assembles with her, if you want to use that Latourian language, but it doesn't sink into her subjectivity. This project was born of my sense that for this period in American history, given its distinctive conditions, most of all the spatial extensiveness of American empire, we could use some new vocabularies to talk about power than what's on offer. What is so essential about media infrastructure is precisely that it is a style of power responsive to that spatial condition. It enacts power over distance. It was a way to govern the situation in which a text would be received, even if those doing the governing were hundreds or thousands of miles away. So before we go further into this discussion about power, it's important to understand a bit of context. The ATS, which you see here on the left, kind of in the left part of this image, like the other big six evangelical benevolent societies at the time, was a massive, incredibly well-resourced institution led by elites. By mid-century, its annual budget was greater than those of most states and several times the endowments of the country's top colleges. Its highest offices were occupied by captains of industry and politicians. Its longest-running president was Theodore Frelinghuysen, the Whig senator and vice presidential running mate to Henry Clay. Its headquarters were situated in Lower Manhattan, the economic center of the US, where it stood shoulder to shoulder with the city's most prominent institutions like City Hall, Tammany Hall, and eventually the New York Times building and other major publishers. Because of the abundance of elite men, the bloated budgets, and the truly audacious vision to convert all of America, it's tempting to take the ATS's power for granted, to presume its might without analyzing how it worked. The first generation of historians of the ATS tended to emphasize this raw power. These 20th century thinkers argued that even though religion had been disestablished at the federal level, the ATS nonetheless represented a quasi-establishment of religion. It acted in ways functionally equivalent to a Department of State. It was thus an institution of social control. And this is the so-called social control thesis. If the US became more Christian in the early national and antebellum decades, and that's something that all the historians agree on, that this was a time of evangelical ascendancy in the US. The question is that people disagree on is how and why. So these historians say it was because the ATS used its considerable resources to flood the country with propaganda. I feel a certain kinship with these historians. I admire their taking seriously evangelical institutionalism and elite power in a way that several generations of their successors did not at all. And yet, a lingering problem with social control is that the ATS could not coerce its readers in any sort of force-backed way. It's not like a policeman slapping on cuffs. Nor did this institution gradually discipline or subjectivate its readers in a Foucauldian sense, or in religious studies, we would say in an Assadian sense. The people it wanted to discipline on the frontier were too far away. The US was an imperialist state, rapidly expanding, amassing 2 million square miles in this period. A disciplinary mode of power, however, as Foucault described it, requires some sort of enclosure for its application, the space of the asylum, for example, being the ideal. The ATS's presence in the lives of those it wished to evangelize was not totalizing or saturating like that. It was fleeting. Discipline requires intimacy, and print media do not confine. By contrast, infrastructure is precisely the strategic attempt to overcome distance. Infrastructure is what enabled the elites of the ATS to connect the pole where its texts were produced in New York on the one hand, to the pole where its readers responded to them on the other. Because those poles were far apart, infrastructure could not compel, but it could prompt. Those are the basic arguments of the book. So for the rest of this talk, I will highlight 2 episodes of the ATS's media infrastructure building. The first one will continue to discuss formats, specifically the ATS's turn toward books in addition to tracts. And the second has to do with the distribution of its materials. And I'm especially interested in a program the ATS called Colportage. But first, episode 1, books. Considering how the institution was called the American Tract Society, and it always valorized tracts as the ideal media format for mass diffusion in all the ways I just mentioned, it's a puzzle why the ATS, shortly after its founding, started to publish books alongside its millions of tracts. And what you're looking at is a stereoscopic view of the Boston branch of the ATS. I don't have a view of the New York branch, which is my focus in the book. But you get a little bit of a sense. This is in the 1870s too. If you can see the windows there on the left, that's the ATS storefront, are filled with beautiful books, fully illustrated, big, gilded. The ATS's first books were all pretty plain looking though, like this. Here's a nice marble binding. This is a pretty typical leather-bound one. They're also small. So here's your scale. The publisher called these plain small books standard evangelical volumes. Content-wise, most standard evangelical volumes were new editions of colonial era Calvinist books, or what David Hall has called steady sellers. These are books, English books, mostly like John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which you see here. The reason they printed these books was not only for their theological superiority, though the ATS certainly thought that, but also because there's no copyright for them, and so they were free to reprint, keeping costs low. As the book program grew and grew, however, the ATS started to produce, in addition to the standard evangelical volumes, a more refined, elegant class of books. And these were intended to compete with the commercial market. These included colorful gilded books, like this one, sweet little gift books like this. And by mid-century, the ATS was producing really quite lavish, elaborate books, like this lovely gilded edition of Pilgrim's Progress. And this one, comparatively, is pretty big. So it looks more like this. Unlike tracts, which were intended to be distributed for free as charity, the books cost money. They're not free, you had to buy them, which is a little odd for a philanthropic publisher, though the ATS subsidized them, and it undersold the American market by about half. So if Harper's came out with a book that was 75 cents, the ATS would produce that title, if it's a Christian title, for 37.5. This pricing model made the ATS deeply unpopular with other publishers, but it made ATS books very attractive in a market, which in the 1830s, books were still considered rather deluxe special items. This was a time when mass reproduction was getting going and starting to democratize book ownership. So the question of this segment of my talk is, why did the ATS turn to this format, which just a few years ago was regarded as inferior to tracts? In other words, what was the infrastructural power of the media format of the book compared to tracts? And what is that power that the institution is seeking to harness? My answer is that the ATS embraced the book in order to better appeal to two segments of the American public. The first of these groups was the middle class. In short, after their first year of operations, or the first few years of operations, the ATS realized that middle class people did not want tracts. This was quite shocking and disturbing to them. They came to this realization after receiving countless reports like this one. And this is coming from a distributor from a well-to-do neighborhood in South Carolina. I think it's worth just taking a look at length. He says, approached an imposing residence with ornamental trees in front, rang the bell at the gate, and accidentally elevating my eye, noticed a middle-aged lady eyeing me from a window. She immediately withdrew. Waiting a few moments, I rang again, and a servant soon made her appearance, and looking over the fence at my bag said, "They won't want 'em things here." Without noticing her remark, I asked, "Is the family at home?" "No, sir," she replied. "MR's tracks, ain't they? They don't want 'em here." Croswell supposed from this encounter that the lady of the house believed that tracks were below her station. It was offensive for a distributor to presume to come knocking at her fine abode, one with fine ornamental trees out front, as if she was in need of his charity. I also want to flag a point about the racial dynamics here. After the housekeeper told him to get lost, Croswell turned on his heels and left. He never paused to consider that the Black woman standing right in front of him would ever want some of his publications, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Croswell's rejection in the genteel neighborhoods of South Carolina was not, however, a complete loss. It was information. One important characteristic of infrastructural power is that it is adaptive. Because infrastructure traverses the space between producers and readers, it also opens up a channel of communication between them. It enables the institution to respond to the resistances it encounters, to learn and adjust, and to become more eclectic as time went on. So in 1833, that's 8 years after the founding, the ATS's solution was to bifurcate media formats. Henceforth, it would manufacture books for the middle class and elites, and tracts would now be primarily for the poor and the vicious. That's a direct ATS quote. Class is not the only variable at play in this turn to books, however. Equally important, though more submerged in the ATS's public records, was sectionalism. The real prize was not just the middle class reader in general, but the middle class or elite white Southerner. Some important context is that the South was producing less than 5% of the overall books in the US at the time. And here I'm talking about bound books, not things like ephemera, tracts, and periodicals, which the South was producing in abundance, but bound books. Given that nationwide shipping for consumer goods was still mired in inefficiencies, this meant that white Southerners had a great demand for bound books, especially as markers of gentility and refinement, things to put in your parlor, but they were inadequately supplied. The ATS recognizes this want as a great opportunity. When the publisher began to set up a fledgling distribution system for its books, the officers voted to supply the southern states first, and they voted to supply them at an extra low, extra subsidized rate. It's also around this time, too, that leaders partnered with prominent Southern evangelicals to promote the book program through the South, and simultaneously, they also entered into a deep complicity regarding slavery. In this year, so we're still in 1833, they systematically censor all of their texts for any mention of slavery. They push out from leadership roles the abolitionist members of the society, like Arthur Tappan, who had founded this, one of the main founders of the society 8 years before. They quietly implemented a policy of not distributing texts to Black people at all, including free Black people. And I explain all of that in greater detail in the book. By the way, all of this was really hard to figure out because the ATS is not forthcoming about this sort of stuff. The main source in learning about them are their annual reports, which are these like eye-repelling, tightly printed 300-page reports about everything that goes on. And often, especially where issues of race and class are concerned, there's little, you can only pick up these kind of little data points, if you're reading really, really carefully, or look really scrutinizing the numbers, because they're not forthcoming about these sorts of things. This multi-pronged campaign to secure Southern buyers with the media format of books at the center was very successful. It worked. So here's a graph for you. The top line that you're seeing here, the solid line, that represents the percentage of books sold by ATS distributors to readers in the 15 southern states out of all of the books sold within the United States. And I'm just offering the data in the years that it's available in the annual reports. That figure was high. It hovered between 33 and 44%, extremely high for a northern publisher. In short, the ATS is sending massive amounts of books south. At least they're doing that until everything crashes out during the Civil War, in which case they're sending no books south, at least at first. And then the dotted line below, that refers to the percentage of donations from those same 15 southern states. And as you can see, those are coming in at a much lower rate. What this disparity suggests is that Southerners did not want to give donations to this Yankee enterprise, but they did want to buy their books. I find this despair to be revealing. The ATS was able to draw them as buyers because it gave them a media format that they desired, even if they were not perfectly aligned ideologically. That they were able to keep these figures high throughout this period, when denominations and national benevolent societies were otherwise being riven by sectionalism, is incredible. So, the Presbyterians split over slavery in 1837. Methodists and Baptists do the same in 44 and 45. Because of those splits, 4 out of the major 6 national evangelical benevolent societies go under. And while all of that is happening in the evangelical world, the ATS is holding steady and even thriving and doing better than it's ever done. And it's doing that because of books. The glue is the book. Another key aspect of what's going on is that books and tracts were not only different material formats, as if format could be considered in isolation. They were also sent along different paths of distribution, and the context of distribution changed how the text was received. Much of this divergence began with selling books. So the ATS's initial sales infrastructure relied on evangelical businessmen. They could be accountants, bankers, jewelers, whatever, who brokered sales out of their offices. The idea was that a businessman could keep a selection of titles on hand, as well as maintain an updated book catalog, so that buyers could order exactly what they wanted from New York. This particular catalog caught my eye because of the manuscript inscription on the cover. It indicates that these books were sold by Knowles and Walford, Richmond. If you can see that, it's right underneath the wood engraved vignette there. What this meant is that in Richmond, around mid-century, a white reader who wanted to browse the latest Christian literature from New York would call at the local. Oh, excuse me. I wanted to tell you. So I wanted to know, who are Knowles and Walford? What is their business? Kind of trying to get a sense of like what that encounter would have been like. So I did a little bit of newspaper searching, and it turned up that Knowles and Walford owned an insurance office specializing in what was called slave insurance. So these are insurance policies on enslaved people to be paid out in the case that the person emancipates themselves or dies. So this meant that if you wanted to buy a book in Richmond, and you were a white elite buyer who could show up at such offices, you would call at this slave insurance office. The space of buying ATS books was the same space that was devoted in the most concrete of ways to reducing people to property. It's also a space in which there would be a medical doctor on the premises every morning and late afternoon to see servants, as the newspaper advertisements put it. This is a disturbing fact, and it brings to the surface a very tangible example of the larger infrastructure of Christian books that I've been describing. In the case of acquiring ATS books in Richmond, the suffering of enslaved people not only underwrote the political economy that supported the ATS, but it was actually the literal setting, the concrete infrastructure for the acquisition of Christian books. This observation about book shopping in Richmond is a useful point of comparison and a segue to the last part of my talk, in which I'll focus on a distribution program called colportage, which was established in 1841. At first, strangely, the ATS did not care very much about distribution. When the institution was only a tract publisher, if you recall, leaders imagined tracts virtually distributing themselves. So if, from the certificate of membership, here they're basically released like a flock of birds, as if they fly through the air. Once the ATS started producing books, however, leaders found themselves forced to think about it because books were difficult to move, books had to be sold, and with books, there's little possibility of spontaneous movement. There's no finding them in the street, there's no magical appearance in your pocket after a night drinking. The other thing going on underfoot is that by 1841, books were not the luxury items they once were, even a few years prior. The ATS now resolves that everyone, including the poor and the vicious, and not just the middle class and elites, should have them. Essentially, what they decide is that what will convert the nation now is the book, not the tract. They still produce tracts, but tracts at this point become a lot more ancillary to the mission. Now they need to find a way to distribute books to settlers on the frontier. That's a very complicated, tricky question. While the businessman agency system involving agents like Knowles and Walford worked well enough for wealthier clientele, who also happened to have a pre-existing desire for books, what about for everyone else? For everyone else, ATS officials developed a scheme called colportage. This is a term that they adapted from French, whose original meaning the ATS actually disastrously really misunderstood, more about which in the book. But in any case, under the terms of the system, the ATS commissioned salaried distributors called colporteurs and sent them throughout the country into new settlements, selling the society's plainest books house to house. They were also allowed to give books away for free when they encountered impoverished people who owned no religious books at all. The idea was to knock at every single house within their assigned area to be truly exhaustive. It was a massive system with 787 colporteurs employed at the height of the program all over the US. I want to say that it was the largest literature distribution system in the world. If anyone knows of a distribution system larger, you should let me know. What you're looking at is a hand-drawn map from a colporteur in New Jersey. Since they're traversing these areas on foot or on horseback, they got to know their fields really well. So they produced maps like these, which they would send back to headquarters, and then their successors would use them, in future canvassing campaigns. One thing to note here is that despite the much purported exhaustiveness of colportage, colporteurs were white men, with one exception, Visiting white settler colonists. I mentioned earlier how the colporteur Micah Croswell ignored a Black woman standing right in front of him. Well, part of that neglect or disinterest had to do with the ATS's obsequiousness around white Southerners. Another reason has to do with the institution's focus on American citizens. The ATS focused on citizens because they thought that citizens were the ones with the political and civic power to change the national character of the United States. Since in this period, the only people who unambiguously possessed citizenship were white, the ATS ignored Black and Indigenous readers almost entirely, with a few interesting exceptions that I describe in the book. And people find this odd for an evangelical group, which you would think is interested, like a soul is a soul, like trying to missionize. And this is also a time of major foreign and domestic missions, kind of most famously, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And the ATS really saw its remit differently. It saw its remit as being the nation and American citizens. They believed on theological grounds that that was who to prioritize in order to convert the world in the fastest way. There's some interesting reported cases in which Black and Indigenous readers demanded a colporteur's attention, seeking them out rather than the other way around, and I describe that in the book. There's also a really interesting example from the late 1850s in which the Cherokee and Choctaw nations hired their own ATS colporteurs, licensed them, and then paid them out of the Cherokee Nation and Choctaw Nation funds, really reversing the whole ATS colportage model. I think that this arrangement, while it would seem kind of at first blush to be a bad deal for those indigenous nations, it's actually an arrangement that allows them to retain their own sovereignty over their territories. Like if Cherokee Nation is paying, then the nation also controls the terms of what's going on. And in fact, when the ATS ran afoul of Cherokee Nation in 1859, they completely canceled the agreement and pulled the colporteur out within days. So there's some kind of interesting things going on at the edges of infrastructural power. But from the view of the ATS, however, it was developing an infrastructure to achieve a Christian nation. And when it was doing that, it was imagining a white Christian nation. That is the main demographic. The origins of today's so-called white Christian nationalism are vast. And I don't purport to try and chart the whole genealogy, but I do think that evangelical societies like the ATS were one tributary. My argument in this part of the book is that the job of the colporteur was not merely to distribute books, like a peddler would. The ATS understood colportage as an unusual opportunity for the ATS in terms of infrastructure. It allowed the colporteur, through the use of a series of techniques, to shape scenes of reader reception at close range. Drawing on various sources like manuals, diaries, and official reports, I argue that colporteurs work to create textual situations. This is my term for the environment and circumstances surrounding a reader's engagement with a text, and it includes the physical space, the manners and deportment of the people within or proximate to it, and the psychological state of the reader. The ATS understood that the environment would have a demonstrable effect on the text's future career with you. A textual situation is thus a form of infrastructure in that it was a technology for the extension of a centralized power over a distance. It prompted or cued the reader and inclined her toward certain results. And this is my last slide. I'm just going to talk over it till the end. The process began when the colporteur knocked on the door to a house. From the start, he had to attend very carefully to his behavior. One manual began with a discussion of the exterior deportment incumbent upon colporteurs. It claimed that their manners must savor of the spirit of heavenly benevolence and of goodwill towards men. A failure here may be ruinous to souls. One's bearing should be open, frank, and manly, advised another manual. Another one instructed the distributor to introduce himself in a quiet, easy way, but at the same time somehow to use a full-toned voice and in a dignified manner. After introductions, the colporteur turned attention toward his books, sometimes offering just a glimpse of them in his knapsack. Display the book, one manual counsels, but keep it in your own hands. Why? The answer is straightforward. Possession is power. Surrender it, and you lose the power of showing it. For the next step, having now built up some anticipation for these exotic wares, the colporteur launched into a series of invasive questions. Your inquiries will be such as these, the manual stated. What is their moral and religious character? Are they members of any evangelical church? Have they children? Do they drink alcohol? If so, if they have children, do they attend the Sabbath or weekday school? Do they have a Bible? Are they in pecuniary distress? All of these questions and their answers were expected to take about 30 minutes. While what the colporteur is doing is partly gathering data that would allow him to tailor his efforts, when this interview is situated as infrastructure, a grander goal emerges. That goal was to capitalize on the effects of questioning itself to prompt in the potential reader a disposition that would make that person vulnerable to the distributor's authority and more receptive to his overtures. One manual plainly describes the purpose in these terms. Our influence over the minds of men is proportioned in a great degree to the directness we have to individuals. By these attentions, their goodwill is secured, and a state of feeling is induced favorable to the reception of religious impressions. Artfully stimulating the state of feeling, as the guide put it, meant that on the one hand, the reader had to feel tenderly cared for. On the other hand, she had to experience anxiety, and the more intense, the better. The colporteur accomplished these dual goals with the carrot and then the stick. First, he had to continue to come across as gentle and caring. After he received responses to the questions, he was instructed to always, quote, follow them up with tender and earnest expostulation. It should be done with delicacy. However, as the conversation intensified, distributors also had to, quote, awaken the unredeemed to a sense of their guilt and danger by picturing the awful consequences of dying in sin. And hellfire and damnation, as you might expect, were prominent themes. The goal of all of this was really interesting. It was to get the person to cry. This was the climax towards which all of these efforts had been building, a sign that the subject had been adequately primed and was almost ready for the books. Tears were so routine that reports were often terse. After 15 minutes conversation, one colporteur recorded, the man wept and trembled, bought $5 worth of books. While weeping was an entirely conventional expression of devotion among men and women in the 19th century, what's noteworthy in our case is that the colporteur did not merely participate in this sentimental mood, he orchestrated it. He summoned the tears, and tears were a sign that it was time to give over the book. With the exchange imminent, it was the colporteur, not the reader, who chose the specific title to be conferred. Though the colporteur selected a given book to match a reader's spiritual needs, the technique, when viewed in terms of an infrastructural framework, improved the chances of a fruitful encounter as well. It created an impression that the book was personalized, special, hand-selected. The colporteur had just the thing for you. Here I will pause and observe just how different this textual situation was compared to ordering books at Knowles and Walford's. In the colportage encounter, there is no shopping, there is no exercise of choice. Instead, something is actually being foisted on you. The final step in this long process was narration. Having chosen the appropriate text, the distributor was directed to relay an anecdote about how that same book had changed the life of someone else, educating a recipient into what a proper response should look like. Once the colporteur had concluded those stories, he handed over the book, collected the payment, and bid goodbye. All of the colporteur's practices, brandishing, selection, and narration, served to consecrate the textual object and thus shape the reader's experience of it. No longer was this book, which the reader was finally holding in her hands, just a book. It was now a singular thing, both a part of and a capsule for the memory of the scene of its conferral. When the reader picked up the book days or years later, which she was now more likely to do given the efforts to dispose her towards it, she would recall the earnest man who conversed with her at length about her soul. One manager even spoke of, quoting him, a sacredness which attaches to books, when the colporteur had done his job well. And still, colportage qua infrastructure stopped short of coercion. Colportage was more confrontational than media format on its own, to be sure, but it was still a short, fleeting experience. Once the colporteur turned his back, the new owner of a book could always put the book on the shelf and forget about it. And after all of that, however, the ATS knew that she was more likely to crack it open and read. So I have just a few words to conclude. This book represents my effort to name and analyze a style of religious power in the 19th century. How does an institution, however well resourced, exert its will on a people if it cannot rely on ideological hegemony, nor on disciplinary subjectivation, nor on brute force? And moreover, if it must do it over the vast distances that characterized American empire and its settler colonialism. My answer is media infrastructure, a form of power that traverses distance, that work to make the messages carried by its media seem compelling. Given its importance and usefulness as a concept, it's odd that infrastructure has not been a topic of interest in humanities scholarship until recently. For some, perhaps, to study infrastructure is to study the boring, as John Durham Peters joked. To be sure, the content and printed texts themselves sometimes seem more vivid and cry out more loudly for attention. The first wager of my investigation, however, is that what lurks below the surface is every bit as fascinating and multitudinous as the content enabled by it. The second is that scholars cannot afford to neglect infrastructure if their goal is to analyze the varieties of power at work in our world. Media infrastructure names just one style of power. Empire of Print traces how it works in the specific case of the ATS and in ways that are organic to the circumstances of the ATS's location, period, style of religion, and set of archives. And yet, as I feel the temptation to steal another glance at my smartphone, as I, to my embarrassment and discomfort, even find myself lying alongside my phone in my bed at night, which I'm sure some of you do as well, it is apparent to me that the example of the ATS may help to cultivate a broader attentiveness to media infrastructure, a form of power that originates outside the self, that assembles with users but does not force them, yet nonetheless can feel inevitable and irresistible. That attentiveness is useful for scrutinizing power in other situations and times. Media infrastructure furnishes a name and invites a mode of criticism for understanding the forms of faraway institutional plotting that constitute the understory of our daily experiences of media as they shape our experiences and incite our wills. So, thank you very much.
Excellent. That was fantastic. Thank you, Sonia. And I just want to point out to the audience that please put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they are starting to roll in, which is great. And as people start formulating some questions, I just wanted to give one to Sonia to help kick things off. So this is really great, and there's so many good things to say about the project, right? The attention to the material format, and also the idea of infrastructure. There's so much more to say. I was curious. I mean, at one point earlier in the slideshow, you showed an image of the ATS headquarters, and you also showed a stereograph, right? So we see some imagery of the print shop, so to speak, the printing operation. And I'm just curious, in your research, did you come across anything about the lives of the people who did work there? I guess this is a question about labor, but I think labor is also part of infrastructure. So, yeah, so what was it like being part of the ATS operation on the ground, so to speak?
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, as one of the massive New York publishers, the ATS had a lot of people working for them. And it's not something that they're really forthcoming about in the sources, but in 1846, there's some reporting on the reopening of the new improved five-story tract house because the ATS invited journalists to come and tour the state-of-the-art facilities. So at that time, the newspapers report that on the fourth floor, there's 30 men and boys who operated the machinery. And on the third floor, there's 100 women and girls doing various things involved in bookbinding. And those numbers presumably grew as the ATS's volume grew into the 1850s. The ATS didn't publicize their wages or working hours, but I'm assuming they were pretty crappy, which is to say similar to what other New York bookworkers made. One thing I learned from Todd Pattison and Elizabeth DeWolf's essay in Suave Mechanicals, they do a lot of great research on this. At Harper's, average pay for women was $14 monthly. $24 monthly for men. It's basically a poverty wage, and they're working 12 hours a day for 6 days a week. It's a really tough job. Another way that the ATS workers do kind of come into the sources, into the scene, is because some of them converted to evangelical Christianity on the job, and ATS was using them as an example, but I don't know how representative that was. We do know a great deal more about the major players in production. These are people like the head printer, Daniel Fanshawe, and the chief of the engraving department, Alexander Anderson, as well as several of the more kind of prominent binders. And I spend time in the book exploring their creative decisions as forms of media format, especially when they bear on reception. And I confess, kind of did less in terms of kind of the labor conditions per se. Maybe one other thing, John, I know that you're interested in Black printers and other book workers, and the only tidbit I have on that front is that in 1859, the ATS sustained a fire. And in some of the newspaper reporting around that, they mentioned that the only person on the scene was a Black porter who worked at the tract house for many, many years. And there may have been other Black employees, but I'm really not sure. So those
That's
are just kind of beginning to answer that huge question.
That's great. That's really interesting. Cheryl Thurber posted a question earlier in the presentation, so we'll start with her question. And her question addresses the colporteurs. She wanted to know more about their work, presumably on the periphery in the West. And she wanted to know, the question is really about were the colporteurs also presumably selling or distributing print materials from other denominations? And she puts in the chat ASSU, but for viewers, that's the American Sunday School Union. So anything to say about their work and maybe other things that they could have been selling or distributing?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. So the relationships between the big evangelical societies is a little complicated. There seems to have been some internal conversation, especially between the American Bible Society and the ATS. And of course, their headquarters are 1 block away in Lower Manhattan. Kind of with the ABS asking the ATS, like, oh, you guys have really figured out distribution. I mean, the ATS was the only one that had this cold portage infrastructure. The ABS was still doing this kind of auxiliary volunteer thing for the whole antebellum period. So they kind of look over at the ATS and they're like, you've really figured out distribution. Like, why don't you just distribute our Bibles too? And it appears that many colporteurs did carry ABS Bibles and distributed them, but both organizations were super hush-hush about this because they didn't want to, give the sense to donors that they, were equivalent organizations or cause donors to only give money to one to the other. I don't know if if they had any kind of the same arrangement with the ATS. Common sense suggests that in some areas they did. But they too, as I understand, like the ABS, relied generally on a more of that old time auxiliary volunteer system. And it was the ATS uniquely that was forging ahead with this kind of ultra modern cold portage system that really acted at the capillary level. But thank you for the question.
More questions are coming in, and Julia Dower asked a question about the visual culture. So she said she was really interested in images. I think particularly the last image you showed of colporteurs presenting books, and also I think more generally the experience not just of sharing a book with somebody, but also experiences of reading. So her question is really about what was there differences you noticed, or did you learn anything in your project about the actual experience of reading these tracts? What was it like for people when they came across these books?
Yeah, so the ATS tried to get people to read in two main ways. They emphasized solo individual reading, and you see lots of images of that in the visual culture of the ATS, kind of the model of like the Puritan model of like going into your closet and having a kind of devotional encounter with your book, kind of in a one-on-one way. And then they also really emphasized family devotion. They thought that kind of whole tradition of families gathered around the hearth with the father reading was a really, really important way of doing that. So you also see, hundreds of images of family reading. So what I think they're doing with those images is that, the images themselves are participating in that visual pedagogy. They're trying to model the certain kind of comportment that they expect faraway readers to kind of take a look at that and try and approximate it in themselves. So yes, I'm absolutely concerned with reading, and my concern, especially with infrastructure, is in how this institution is trying to govern that reading experience from far away. Thanks.
Another question here about also a question not necessarily about readers, but really about audience, it seems. So Eric E. Fulton asks about what about the situation where presumably the audience or the people that might be receiving these tracts may already be, quote, as they say, professors of religion, or in other words, already devout, or in other words, already on the side of the ATS ideology. So, how did ATS predict that and respond to that very likely possibility?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So this was part of the movement from tracts to books, is that they really imagined at the founding that the American continent was just full of these poor and vicious people, immigrants coming from Europe who were unchurched or, papists, Catholics suffering from papal delusions, or were lukewarm, and needed the tract to kind of shock them into being. But the other thing that's going on at this time is that being a Christian, a church-going Christian, is eminently respectable middle-class behavior that was widely expected and accepted. So one of the things they're doing with that turn to books is trying to create some kind of media object that the people who are already converted, or people who can understand themselves as already converted enough, could enjoy and not be offended by. And the focus there was really, really different. It was not to spark, a long conversion process. It was rather to kind of cultivate a kind of to kind of develop their piety in kind of more of a smoldering way rather than like fireworks. But that question for the ATS was very, very classed.
We've got many more questions coming in. We're going to take, I think, two more. Ben Bascom says that he's like many other people in the program. Congratulations! It sounds like a fascinating book. Ben is interested in the language of prompting, and I think particularly the difference between prompting and compelling. So, could you say more? Ben says he's interested in how this difference or distinction relates to the language of feeling and sentiments, and more generally, thoughts you might have about this really important point you have about the kind of soft influence that the tracks had upon people.
Yeah, Ben, I'm going to have to take your notes on this. I'm using prompting, cueing, compelling somewhat interchangeably, and perhaps I could exercise more precision there. I was really trying to seek a vocabulary that tried to get at this question of what is a kind of force that is not like a force-backed or a Foucauldian disciplinary power on the one hand, but was also not just like, oh, readers creatively doing whatever in their own creative formations, agency, blah, 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 on the other. Um, uh, because if that was the case, if the second thing was the case, the ATS would just close up shop and go home. They understood themselves as participating in a kind of form of governance. I was, as a scholar, as a thinker, reader, I was having a hard time finding that vocabulary that would kind of get at that muddy middle that's not force, but also not nothing. And I was rather dissatisfied with things that were on offer, including the word influence. I saw somebody in the chat said, what do you think about influence? And then I, got really inspired by Deleuzean ideas and also the work of Bruno Latour. And I started to think about infrastructure in terms of an assemblage, is that which isn't like a strong power, but assembles with people and is not nothing either. And from there, I kind of settled on words like prompting and cueing. But I think these are difficult questions, and they're things that I want to. That's you're hitting on kind of the conceptual heart of the book and things that are well worth thinking about more. Thank you.
And there are many questions here coming about concepts and theories. And I think, given that we're coming towards the end of the program, we'll just encourage them to read the book to learn more. But we'll end with the collections question. So there's a question, somebody was just really interested in the stereograph that you showed of ATS in Boston. Where did you find it? And maybe we can add to that, what other kind of visual sources are out there that people might want to look into?
Well, this is something that Lauren Hughes directed my attention to. So all praise for Lauren Hughes and all of the archivists at AAS. I wouldn't have been able to find this on my own. I was in the reading room and she's going through hundreds of stereoscope slides and says, "Oh, would you be interested in this?" Yes, I would. Um, one of the things that I was on the case for was to look for visual representations of the AAS, and I collected as many as I could. And this was kind of one of the more interesting, compelling things. This is from the 1870s, and one kind of bummer about working in the earlier part of the period is that it's right before you get a proliferation of photographic reproductions. So anything that I could kind of tap, even though this is Boston, not New York, anything that I could do to kind of help me visualize and imagine what this stuff really looked like was precious to me. So I don't. The answer to your question is ask Lauren, ask the AAS archivist.
All right. Well, maybe that's a good place to close. Thank you so much, Sonia. We are going to wrap up today, but I do want to encourage people to look at our website to learn more about our upcoming programs. At this point, we have a pretty full calendar going well past the summer. I do just want to highlight just briefly our next public program, which will feature art historian Michael Leisha, who will be giving the Jane Ramsey Pomeroy Lecture. And this is going to be related to his brand new book, which is called A Flood of Pictures, The Formation of a Picture Culture in the United States. And that program is going to be on April 9th. It will be both in person at Antiquarian Hall and also streamed online. So thanks again, Sonia. This has been a really fascinating project, and we're so excited that the book is finally out. And we're going to wrap up now. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.